I'm going to do a quick overview of the Kogs project and the supporting technologies. We will be using Vue.js. If you're not familiar with it, this is the home page. If you look at its GitHub repository, you'll see that it's widely popular. It's simply a new instance or a new generation of a lot of the frameworks that have existed in the past, like Angular and others. You can also use it partially, meaning you do not have to do a full commitment, which is often advantageous. The other thing to mention as well is that we will be using CLI 3, the latest generation of the command line interface, in that for styles we will use Bootstrap. Now here it's important to note that we will not be using the JavaScript libraries or jQuery or any of other of those things that Bootstraps use it, but simply the styles. The other thing to note as well, after you get some of the basics on Vue.js, in the CLI is to make sure you also take a look at routing and state management with Vuex. It's just any type of web application has tremendous challenges when it comes to state, and Vuex is just a good way to do it. If you're doing something simple, you don't need it. If you're doing something quite complex and you find yourself struggling, this is a good thing to use. Next, let's take a look at the file system. As you can see here, I have the Kogs project. I'll mirror this up, or I'll sync this up to GitHub in a moment or after I'm finished recording, and I'll send out the link. But if we step into it, we see the common configuration of a Vue.js project. You can see here the node modules. You can see the public, and inside of here, I'll make a note. And here is the place where we use or we bring in the Bootstrap styles. That's really the only place where we touch Bootstrap, and it just gives us a common set of styles that we can use throughout. So let me go ahead and go back to the file system. The other thing to note is that everything when it comes to the source is under the source directory. Inside of here, we have main, router, store, which we will not be using at the moment, components, and views. And I'll refer to these as I go through the code. So let me start going through the code. As I mentioned, the only reason to take a look at the index.html, which is in the public here, is to note, as I mentioned, that that is where we bring in the styles. Other than that, you don't need to take a look at it. In fact, this is dynamically managed for you and you shouldn't touch it. The first file to note is the main.js file. And if we go back into the file system, you'll see that it is this file. There are a few things to note here. This is just part of the framework, and the other two are router and store. So here's where we create the instances of routing that we use through the system, and the store is for state management. In this case, we won't use it. I mentioned this is something to use in case you have a challenging state management problem. The other thing to note, let's see. No, that's pretty much it about this. And as you'll note, this references router. That's the component that I have on my next tab. This is also the file you see here. And so if you take a look at this, you can see here that I'm laying out the structure, the top structure for the site. I have 4 main components. I have home, cogs, login, and about. And below it, I'm laying out the routes. And you can see here how each of them are laid out. The first one is the path that the user will type in the browser. The second one is just a name to reference internally. And the third one is the component that you're mapping to that route. And all of those get defined here, as you see. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the very first thing that gets loaded. You can see here that app is the very first thing that gets brought in. And this is the default component that gets loaded if nothing else gets loaded. So let's take a look at that, and that's this next tab. And as you can see here, I have a navigation div that simply references those paths that we just defined in the router. I'm also bringing in one component, as you can see here, navigation, and that is simply the top bar of the page. And I'll show you that in a minute. And you can see here that how I bring that in. I define or I create an instance of that component, the navigation component. I then register it as a component here. And then I create an instance of it up here on this line, on line 3. And the rest of it, as I mentioned, is the router and the links to those paths we defined. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and take a look at that. And I'm going to go ahead and run. This is Npm Run Serve. All of this is the default settings for the project. And I should say that if you haven't used this before, it dynamically saves for any changes that you make, so you do not have to stop and run again. But let's go ahead and go back to the browser. I believe I'm here. And you'll be able to see here the top page. And as you can see, I am loading that top section. This one right here, that is home, cogs, login, and about, are those paths or are those settings that are here on the app.view. So this is the topmost hierarchy. Everything else gets loaded below it. And this will always be in the context. So if you want to bring anything that you want to have accessible everywhere in the UI, you can bring it in here. Now, the other thing to note as well is that we have this section here called Popular Cogs that is not part of the app page that we were just taking a look at. And that is the default route that gets loaded. As you can see here, that is this route, and it is the home component. And if we go ahead and take a look at that, you'll see that the content that we're viewing in the browser, Popular Cogs, is the content that we have on the code. So popular cogs, sorry, and the rest of it is that definition. And note that that view or that component itself is bringing in another one. That's not defined in paths. That's just something that you can do, and that's a hierarchy that I defined in this structure. And you can see here that I have a hello world component, and I'm passing a message into that component. I define it just as I did before in the previous page, meaning I reference it and create an instance of it. You can see here the path, registering it as well. And if we were to go ahead and take a look at this, it is simply displaying that message that we're passing in. So you can see here, we create an instance of the component. There's the path for it. We will look at it in a second. Where it is, then we reference it with the tag, we pass a message in. That message inside of the component, here it is, hello world.view, is then simply shown here on line 3. And we define or we catch that message here, and you can see here that this is called message and this is called message, and we receive it as a string. So there's the full hierarchy, right? We have the app that defines this layer, and it also brings in this top navigation. I didn't mention that. That's that navigation control. So if we go back to app, we see here that's that navigation tag that I referred to, and the rest of it is just simply the router nav that we're showing. And then after that, we load that hello world component, and that says popular cogs, and you can see here that we're doing that greeting from that component that home is loading in itself. Now I have the exact same structure for the rest of the sections. So if I click on cogs, we'll see here that we see the cogs view and then the cogs component. And if we go back to the code, we'll see here that in views, we have a cogs component or cogs view. And then inside of it, if we go to cogs, we also have that C1. And I'll show you this right now in the code. So if we take a look at cogs, you can see here the cogs component, they all follow pretty much the same structure. They have a section that is layout, then they have a section that is script, and you could follow that up with a section that is style. But as I mentioned, I set the styles globally. So in this case, this path is being set. Remember, the paths are set in the router. This is the cogs path. That path brings in the cogs component. This is the cogs component that is under those views folder. And that's what you see there on the UI. I'm also bringing in a subcomponent to that view, which is inside of the cogs folder. That's C1, right? So if we go in here again, you can see it. And then we pass a message again. I'm passing a message again in this case. And you can see here the long greeting from C1 component, and that's what we see in the UI. So there you have a hierarchy. This is quite flexible. You have the main components at this point. You'd have to start populating. We only have one component. That's why I called it C1. You'd have a multitude of them on a page. You start to have some component communication. That's what you would use your state management for. There's a number of ways to do this, but I wanted to keep this one fairly small. The only other comment I would make is there is also the Firebase side, but I'll reference that on a different video. So for this, that's it. Goodbye.